we're going to make a case for why we care about this, why you should all care about it. We'll spend a good chunk of the time talking about some important foundational concepts. Hopefully have some opportunity to invite you all to reflect on why this matters to you in your work, and then we'll wrap up. If there's time, we will certainly have discussion. So why do we care about this? I think the context of our current events makes all of us increasingly aware of some of these issues. This is a Portland Press Herald article about protests that were here in Portland, Maine in the context of George Floyd's death. Here's an organization called White Coats for Black Lives. And some of you may have participated. These are both photographs taken outside Maine Med of providers taking a knee and taking a stand to support Black lives. And ultimately, this all matters to our patients, and we know that demographics are rapidly changing. So our country is projected to be a majority-minority population by the middle of this century. And this is reflected in our own communities. We're increasingly treating diverse racial and ethnic minority populations here at Maine Med and in our larger Maine Health community. Interpreter services at Maine Med provided services in 34 languages a couple years back, with Somali, Arabic, French, and Spanish representing the highest percentages. And we also know that Maine has an aging population. So along with increasing racial and ethnic diversity, we have an aging population, and we have a lot of socioeconomic diversity in our state. So it matters to our patients, it matters to ACGME. So for those of us involved in training, which most of you are, and I'm a program director, so I'm kind of aware of the changing requirements, which really for the first time in 2019, there is language in our ACGME program requirements that we must attend to recruiting and retaining a diverse workforce. So for those of us involved in training, this is really a must do. We know that our institution cares. Respect is one of our pretty clearly defined values. And if you kind of zoom in on that, they note that we embrace diversity and acknowledge each person's uniqueness. That's really part of our institutional value of respect.
And we are, you know, as an institution, the conversation about diversity and inclusion it's ongoing and it's evolving as we continue to have more people engaged in the conversation. And this particular model, it's from the Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmarks. And I just wanted to frame real quick, when you look at it, it kind of looks at the various different dimensions that an organization would focus on when we were looking at these topics with regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so you could see, as we're talking about from a strategic, organizational direction, we're going to want to look at all of these different areas. If you put all of your energy toward one, then you don't often move the dial in the culture. And so thinking about the foundation, but also thinking about our recruitment and also thinking about how we're assessing and what are we doing in our community. All of those things become in interplay to be an organization that sort of leads the effort with DEI. So this is just one model of many, but I thought I'd just put that up there to kind of show you how we're thinking as an organization about these topics. We also define, if you can go to the next slide, Erin, when, you know, organizations often define diversity in a pretty broad way, and that is not to say that we want to ignore any one dimension of diversity. It's to say that we want to think about all of the different areas on this wheel. This is just one of many sort of diversity wheels, but all of the different areas and how they interplay, so that when we're making decisions and we have committees and we have people at the table, we're considering all of these dynamics. You can have the most diversity possible in a workforce. It doesn't mean that those diverse voices and perspectives are included in decision making and in operations. And so a big part of looking at D&I from an organizational lens is looking at all of these dimensions and creating the appropriate structures and processes so that all of these different people's perspectives interplay in how we're operating as an organization. And so the initial stages of our work, if you can go to the next slide, Erin, this is just an example. I'll go quick, but as you're seeing D&I kind of rolling out in the organization, you'll see some strategic kind of like what I like to call arms of DEI. And there'll be governance, Beth is sitting on that committee and really looking at how we're implementing this work strategically, how we're allocating our resources. There'll be opportunities to participate in task forces. So anyone on the call, you're in a committee with family medicine, but you might decide, I really have an interest in this particular initiative that the institution is working on, and you could participate in a task force. And then Beth talked about the ambassador program. That's an example of engagement, education, support, really continuing to ensure that we have inclusive voices representing throughout the organization. So a lot more to come on this. We're just sort of at the initial stages, but I thought we would frame that up front, that this is an example of the strategic work you'll be seeing moving forward.
One of the things that Beth mentioned is the curriculum that I'm working on. So I have a MITE Educational Innovations grant, and I'm working to develop a modular curriculum covering topics related to DE&I. So I'm just now sort of curating materials, and I would really love help and suggestions. If you have favorite TED Talks, podcasts, journal articles, lay press articles, feel free to send them my way, and I can put them into the right modules. So more to come on that. So now we're going to kind of shift and cover some of those concepts. And again, this will be probably review for many of you, but I think in the effort of creating common shared language, it's important that we are all sort of aware of these concepts. So these are the things we're going to just touch on briefly and just give you a quick introduction to each of these. So cultural humility, I think, is an important place to start. And for me, this is really a stance, and it's a stance of lifelong learning and humility with patients that I sit with and families that I sit with. Melanie Tervalon, who's someone who writes a lot about cultural humility, notes that it incorporates a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique, rather than simply considering cultural competence, which implies a detached mastery of a theoretically finite body of knowledge. So I think language is important, and as Ryan mentioned, language is constantly shifting and changing, and historically we talked about cultural competence. The more kind of current language is to talk about cultural humility, that none of us check a box and say, yep, I'm culturally competent, my work here is done. We all are kind of continuing to learn in an ongoing way. Some of this examination can generate cognitive dissonance or cognitive disequilibrium, which is experiencing inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes. And it feels a little uncomfortable, and that's okay. That's part of the work, and hopefully over time there will be safe places and groups to kind of talk about this with each other as we all kind of dive into this important work.
These are some of the steps to cultural humility, and we're not going to go into them in depth. I like to kind of just frame it to say a big part of it is what Erin was saying. It's in that that lifelong learning and that willingness to know that there really isn't an expertise, that we're always learning, we're always growing, and we're doing it through experience, our own experiences, but really openness and curiosity about others' experiences. So this is, I like to look at this slide as aspirational, to say something like being egoless. None of us are 100% egoless, but we can work toward being open, being aware, being willing to get the feedback, and recognizing when our biases are getting in the way, and recognizing that our own experiences are not the defining experiences, and that's a big part of cultural humility. So as we get into the topics of race and ethnicity, we thought it was important just to kind of define those two, because you'll hear often race and ethnicity used interchangeably, and a lot of people don't think about the two differences. So, you know, the definition I find the simplest to understand is that race is generally associated with physical characteristics in biology. It's skin color, it's your hair texture, and it is a social construct. So we have said, you know, socially, these are these categories based on these physical discriminatory definitions. Ethnicity is often looked at as cultural expression and cultural identification, and they're not always lined up. In other words, oftentimes people in sort of Western-centric white perspectives don't realize that you can have a white race, a white person with a very different ethnicity than perhaps someone from America. So you might have someone who is Spanish and white, right? And so oftentimes I'll talk to white people who will say, well, wait a second, whiteness, you can't have a different ethnicity and be white, and that's not the case. And so it's cultural expression, cultural identification versus physical characteristics. Are you taking this one, Erin?
Oh, sure. I think this is a pretty timely topic right now. We are all talking about race and racism and structural racism, including the impact within health systems. And we'll talk a little bit more about this idea that the real pandemic is racism, how COVID-19 is really disproportionately affecting Black and Brown communities. So we don't have time today to show you this whole TED Talk, but I would recommend you watch this or other TED Talks by Kamara Jones. She was here at Maine Med, I want to say maybe 5 years ago, and she's a fabulous speaker, and she's really does a lot of work looking at race and looking at racism. So this is one of her kind of seminal papers back from 2000, and she used this analogy. She sort of compared her hobby or interest in gardening with racism and talked about the 3 different levels of racism. And so this is an area that's been getting a lot of discussion lately in the lay press, this idea of institutionalized racism. So this is when people have differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society based on their race. It's normative, it's structural, having been codified in our institutions, our practices, and our laws. It's often evident as inaction in the face of need, and there's not necessarily a clearly identified perpetrator when you think about institutionalized or structural racism. This is a cartoon that I like because I think it really exemplifies what we're talking about with institutionalized racism. So here you have a Black couple going into a bank in Atlanta, and the woman behind the desk says, you need to speak to one of our loan officers, who's in the background there with a KKK hood on. So how is racism sort of woven into the very fabric of our society, of our institutions, of our healthcare system? The second kind of level of racism that Kamara Jones writes about is this idea of internalized racism. And this is acceptance by members of stigmatized races of the negative messages about their own abilities and their own intrinsic worth. So this really reflects systems of privilege, our societal values. It erodes the individual sense of value, which you can imagine really contributes to health disparities. And it undermines the ability to come together and have some collective action. So I'm going to try to show you this video. Let's see if it plays from here. This is an example of internalized racism.
In Brown versus Board of Education.
Can you all see the video?
Yeah, we got it.
Okay, great.
In Brown versus Board of Education, the famous case that desegregated schools in the 1950s, Dr. Kenneth Clark conducted a doll test with Black children. He asked them to choose between a black doll and a white doll. In most instances, the majority of the children preferred the white doll. I decided to reconduct this test as Dr. Clark did to see how we've progressed since then. Can you show me the doll that you like best or that you'd like to play with? Okay. That one. I like to play with this. And can you show me the doll that is the nice doll? And why is that the nice doll? And can you show me the doll that looks bad? Okay. And can you give, and why does that look bad? Because it's black. And why do you think that's a nice doll? Because she's white. And can you give me the doll that looks like you? "15 out of the 21 children preferred the white doll."
So I don't know about you all, but I work with children, and I just find that incredibly sad that, you know, early in childhood, kids have learned and internalized messages about their worth and their value in the world. You know, I think there's lots of internalized isms that we learn in our society. So in my work in the gender clinic, I'm often helping kids sort of explore internalized homophobia and internalized transphobia as they emerge a more solid sense of identity. So I think this is important. It's an important kind of level of racism to be aware of because it really greatly impacts health disparities.
It also sort of reinforces the structural racism, and that's part of the challenge. Is that they don't always separate. They're like a Venn diagram, and it's a reinforcing factor when we're trying to dismantle these systems of oppression, and it's something to just be really aware of.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it started the next.
Another thing, as we're waiting for the slides to pull up, that I think sometimes we don't think about, often in conversations about racism, people go to really looking at the experiences of Black individuals versus the experience of white individuals. And certainly right now, especially, that's very important. It's always been really important. And right now we know that Black lives matter, right? And we know that we need to spend time really focusing on this oppression. And as we focus on oppression, as it relates to Black people's experience, what we don't often think about, or what people don't often think about, is that by dismantling that sort of the systemic racism that we're talking about, it improves the experiences of everyone else. So racism impacts everyone, and it's important that we really look at that systemic issue so that it improves all experiences.
The next sort of related concept is the idea of microaggressions. So, you know, more subtle bias, more subtle messaging about somebody's value based on different aspects of identity. So this is an article from Daryl Wing-Sue back from 2010, so it's a little bit old. But he talks about sort of examples of common racial microaggressions. So one example, when a white couple, a man and a woman, pass a Black man on the sidewalk, the woman automatically clutches her purse more tightly while the white man checks for his wallet in his back pocket, right? So this hidden, totally unspoken message is that Blacks are prone to crime and up to no good. And these are the sort of experiences that marginalized people have all the time, and it's an incredible burden to bear. And so Daryl Wing-Sue talks about a number of things that we all can do to overcome microaggressions and to not be the sort of the perpetrators of microaggressions. And so he writes that we should learn from constant vigilance of our own biases and fears. We have to experience reality. We have to interact with people who are different from us. We have to not be defensive, as Ryan mentioned. We have to be open to discussing our own attitudes and biases and how they might have hurt other people. And he also talks about being an ally, that we have to stand personally against all forms of bias and discrimination. So really the socio-political context of our society, including the laws, regulations, the policies, the practices, the traditions, and the ideologies, all influence these concepts and the way they impact us and the way they impact our patients. You know, I sometimes have fellows or residents who say, oh, this stuff is so political and I'm not political, I don't want to worry about this stuff. And I push it back on them and say, maybe it's political, but we all have to be political in order to best advocate for our patients, particularly when they come from minority groups or marginalized groups, that we have to help amplify their voices to get healthcare needs met. So I think kind of about marginalization and privilege as two sides of a coin, that we all likely have aspects of both. And I think it's useful for each of us to sort of examine our own areas of privilege and also our own areas of marginalization. So this is not an inclusive list, but these are sort of various ways that people can be marginalized or stigmatized in the world. I'm just gonna put them all up there.
And when you think of microaggressions, if you can look at this list and see microaggressions happening with regards to all of these different stigmatized identities. And I challenge you, start watching TV from the lens of do I see microaggressions? And if you watch most sort of popular culture, you will see many of these categories being represented as a microaggression.
I think another useful kind of construct or way to think about these ideas is to consider our headwinds and our tailwinds. So our headwinds are those sort of areas that push against us, our areas of marginalization, our aspects of our identities that hold us back, that make our paths forward more challenging. And the flip side of that is our tailwinds. So those are our areas of privilege, the forces that push us along, that propel us towards our goal. And maybe we didn't earn these privileges, but we were granted them. Our paths might have been paved differently compared to others. So I think it's important, again, to think about marginalization and privilege and the intersectionality, that all of us have complex identities and we likely have aspects of both. And so it's important to do some self-reflection, but also to think about the headwinds and tailwinds for our patients. So, I think a still useful concept is this idea of minority stress theory that comes out of psychology literature. And so the assumptions here that if you're part of a minority group, you have this unique additive stress that's experienced on top of the stress that all of us have, right? So life is stressful, but if you're part of a marginalized group, you have these added stressors. You required an adaptation effort above that required of similar others who are not stigmatized. And probably many of you, if you think about your areas of marginalization, can think about ways that you've had to do this sort of extra adaptation effort. Minority stress is chronic. It's related to relatively stable underlying social and cultural structures. And minority stress is socially based. So it stems from social processes, institutions, and structures outside of and beyond the individual. The last level of racism that Kamara Jones writes about is personally mediated racism. So this is things like prejudice. So when we have differential assumptions about abilities, motives, and intentions of others, as well as discrimination. So we have differential actions. This can manifest as a lack of respect, as suspicion. So if you think about like shopkeepers' vigilance, devaluation, when someone is surprised at how competent somebody is. It can result in scapegoating and dehumanization. So police brutality is a great example of that level of racism. All right, so from marginalization, we get to privilege. Peggy McIntosh, who's a social worker, wrote this seminal piece back in 1989 called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And it was, again, sort of this landmark paper about white privilege. And again, white privilege is just one example of privilege. But as providers, you know, we, regardless of race and ethnicity, have a certain amount of privilege based on the credentials after our name. And with that comes some power that we have to be aware of when we're sitting with our more vulnerable patients. So here's just an example of some of the language from her article. So her article talks about all of the many things she can do in the world without worrying about her own personal safety, in contrast to many people who don't have that privilege. So I'll just read a couple for examples. She says, I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I can avoid spending time with people whom I was trained to mistrust and who have learned to mistrust my kind or me. If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I would want to live. So she goes on. And some of you may have participated in privilege walks before, or seen a privilege walk where you sort of are asked to take a step forward based on a prompt, or take a step backward based on a prompt. And so it's kind of a nice way to explore your own level of privilege, and you might find it a little surprising. This was a little video. Some of you might have seen this or heard of this. I think the flip side of white privilege is what people of color in our country have to endure every day. So I'm just going to try to play this for you. I think it's about a minute.
Don't put your hands in your pockets. Don't put your hoodie on. Don't be outside with no shirt on. Check in with your people. It don't matter even if you down the street. Don't be out too late. Don't touch anything you're not buying. Never leave the store without a receipt or a bag, even if it's just a pack of gum. Never make it look like there's an altercation between you and someone else. Never leave the house without your ID. Don't drive with a white beat on. Don't drive with a do-rag on. Don't go out in public when you need. Don't ride with the music too loud. Don't stare at a Caucasian woman. If a cop stops you randomly and start questioning you, don't talk back. Just compromise. If you ever get pulled over, hands on the dashboard, and ask, could you get out your license and registration?
So I think that's a nice example of sort of the flip of white privilege, that this mom had to teach all of these lessons to her teenage boy to keep him safe and alive in the world. And it's, again, I think pretty sad.
Don't put your hands in your...
So the next concept is health disparities, and we're not going to talk a lot about this. You all know probably more than I do about health disparities. There's a number of kind of foundational reports that have come out of the Institute of Medicine over the years, talking about crossing the quality chasm, unequal treatment, and this one from 2012, how far have we come in reducing health disparities? And sadly, we have not come far enough. So this is data from a 2013 CDC report, and they sort of highlight increased morbidity and mortality for just about every disease category you can imagine for Black and brown people in our country. And I think, you know, what's timely and happening at the moment is the fact that COVID-19 is really disproportionately affecting communities of color, and that is equally true in Maine. So this was a Bangor Daily News article from a couple weeks ago, and the title is Maine has failed as racial disparities in coronavirus infections grow, immigrant leaders say. So I think, again, it's up to all of us to think about how health disparities are impacting people disproportionately. The next concept is bias, implicit bias, and I think this concept has made it much more into everybody's awareness, and hopefully you all have had the chance to do some trainings or check out the Harvard implicit bias tests. And I like to just point out that this is an area where people get kind of defensive. It sort of makes us upset, and again, it generates that cognitive dissonance, like wait a minute, I think this is my value, and yet I take this implicit bias test and something really different comes out. What does that say about me? I would say we all have these biases, right? If you have a brain, you are biased. We humans probably have evolutionary reasons for being biased. But many of these snap judgments that we make today, they're not accurate and they're not necessary for our survival. So implicit bias or implicit social cognition, sometimes called unconscious bias, refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So we're not even necessarily consciously aware that we have these beliefs and these biases. And they are different from the known biases that individuals may choose to conceal for the purposes of social or political correctness. So they're not necessarily accessible through just kind of thinking. Here are some important characteristics of implicit biases. They're pervasive. Again, they don't necessarily align with our declared beliefs. We tend to favor our own in-group. We favor people who we think are like us, whether they are like us or not. And I think the good news is these are malleable. And doing some self-reflection and some work around implicit biases is really the first step. So many of you have probably taken some of these. If you go to Project Implicit, which is a Harvard program, there are tests for just about every characteristic of humanity that you can imagine. And what they do is they flash you these pictures really quickly, and you have to sort of make a split-second response or reaction, and then you get a report at the end. So if you haven't had a chance, I would encourage you to do these or to do other implicit bias tests or training.
So it's implicit bias, and really all of these concepts exist in medicine. We know they're here. There's systemic racism in how the institution of medicine was even sort of established. And so it does have an impact on how you're treating patients. And this slide is kind of complicated, but the idea of the slide is just that when you think about, as a clinician, there's a bias that you're bringing to interacting with your patient based on your own background experiences and based on, your training. The patient is also coming into relationship with you with their own bias. And I think sometimes we forget that piece and kind of focus on our own biases. But when you think all the way back to cultural humility, that idea of getting curious is to try to uncover and understand the biases coming into the conversation with you so that you're able to explore your own and your patient's own biases. But all of that, the background experiences, the biases impact the behaviors and the decision making, and it impacts the clinical encounter. And so this was just an example about a patient that might, a Black patient who has a need for hypertension control. And based on their experiences and based on the clinical provider's experiences, the decision was made that this particular patient did not need an intensification of their medication. So they chose, because of the bias perspective, was that the patient would not be compliant with the medication. The patient's bias was that the provider wasn't going to care for them. Whether that's true or not, the information in this report didn't go into that, but it's basically saying that this patient didn't get the need met because of these biases, and it ended up reducing the hypertension control of that patient. And so oftentimes the biases are steeped in everything that Erin was mentioning, as well as in what you think is really good quality medical care based on your background and experiences. But ultimately, it still impacts the outcome of the patient's experience.
This is sort of our last foundational concept, and this is the idea that differentiating equality from equity. So if you look at the top slide, you can see equality is when everyone is given the same thing. And that sounds pretty good. So I think in medicine, that's the way we have run things for a long time. We treat everyone the same. We give everyone the same thing. And this slide demonstrates pretty nicely that giving everyone the same is not good enough. That we need to think about equity. We need to think about what that individual needs in order to be healthy and successful. So I guess I would put it out there to all of you to think about, how are you as a provider, how is your group, how is our institution doing moving away from equality and moving towards a place of equity. It absolutely means more work for us sometimes to stop and think, wait a minute, let me not be on autopilot here. Let me think about what are the barriers for this particular patient who might be homeless or have a substance problem or be part of an immigrant community where there are cultural barriers. And how do I take the extra time to make sure that we've come up with a really collaborative treatment plan that the patient will actually be able to follow?
And these are some strategies that are sort of recent. This health disparities field is continuing to emerge. As Erin said a little bit ago, there's a lot of research and conversation about it. We haven't really moved the dial. So it's an emerging field. Lots more research is happening. These are some recent things that were, really recent publications. At the system level, one strategy is really in the increasing of diverse practicing physicians. And so we know that there is research that shows that decreases disparity. And so as an organization, one focus might be to try to really increase diversity among practicing physicians. But I wanted to put some strategies here that you as individuals can focus on. The focus of that commitment to cultural humility. So today being sort of a primer to these concepts, but as an individual, how can you continue to have these conversations and continue to learn and grow and read different books and watch different videos and talk to different people and just keep yourself learning is a part of it. This idea of establishing a habit of mind really went into what Erin was just saying. It's to try to recognize that each person that you treat has their own unique experiences and needs, and to create an equitable environment means not treating them all the same, not treating all the patients equally, right? But to think about the equity piece. So trying to go into an encounter with recognition that there's a bias. There was a study I was reading that said, you know what, even when providers started to say, okay, I know I have a bias, when they go and interact with their patient, it decreased the disparity or increased the outcomes. And so just by that saying, I know I probably have a bias here, what is it? Starts to move the dial. This idea of individuating, there was an interesting study that they were looking at taking providers and working with white providers to be able to differentiate Black faces. And so you might say, well, that seems strange, but research shows that white people have a hard time differentiating Black people, Black faces. And so this study worked with white providers to really build a conscious differentiation, and that actually led to an increase in positive health outcomes. And so by being able to move one's perspective from a categorical grouping of people's needs to that individual in front of you seems to move the dial. And the last one is really on perspective taking, which is, part of cultural humility, but the idea that, again, sort of that conscious attempt to really envision as best as you can what that other person's view might be, what that other person's world might be like. It's hard, right? Because it's an intellectual practice. When you layer on privilege and all of these other concepts we're talking about, it isn't as though you're going to fully be able to embody someone else's experience. But the idea here, and this one study was just demonstrating, if a provider can take that time to make a conscious effort, consciously saying, I'm going to try to understand that person's experience, it can positively increase positive outcomes. So I kind of wrapped all this up to say at the individual level, it's about consciousness. Right? It's about a sort of a conscious decision point that I'm going to not be on autopilot in interacting with the patients. At the system level, there's certainly a barrier that is time and your ability to do that. But right now, the research is saying that the providers at the individual level can take that continued learning and that conscious effort, we can start to move the dial. So these were some questions that we kind of put up here as just a place for you to be thinking about, and then we'll open up to Q&A. But the idea was, what's something today that might be new to you? What did you learn or reinforced what you already knew, or maybe that you disagreed with, but just something that you want to continue to explore, thinking about how you might integrate these concepts into your daily work. So maybe was there one thing that you're wanting to make a different, more conscious effort around in your daily work. And then we thought about, what are some personal goals that you might have that you could set for yourself, because this is lifelong learning, because we're all growing. Is there something you can tangibly say, here's a goal for myself in my learning process?
Before questions happen, I know people will start leaving. So first, I just want to say thank you. It was a terrific overview. And I think going through the sort of, it's language, but it's also knowledge, right? And so making sure that we all are on the same page is incredibly helpful. And, we can hear this over and over again. And every time I learn something, and I know that other people do as well. So really appreciate your time. We will share your slides. And if you're willing, we will also share a video of the slides of you presenting. If people have questions, they can send them to me and I can bundle them together and get them to you, if that's okay. And I know people have to run, so if you have to run, please do. For those who have questions and want to stay, hopefully you guys can stick around until 1-ish to just answer any questions that might come up. So thank you again for your time. It's terrific.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us.
Questions, anybody? And if you're muted, make sure you unmute. People are so used to having me mute them that it's also very hard to, get 50 people to sign on. I'm going to ask a question, and but please feel free to interrupt me, anybody who wants to start asking a question. I'm just wondering about the modules, Erin, in terms of where do you think they'll go first, and how do we get access to them? Because I think, again, ideally everybody, right, not just the residents, because often the residents are ahead of the rest of us, but all providers and staff get this foundational knowledge. And I would love to sort of think about how to get the word out there, besides inviting you guys to do this work, but really how do we have some online trainings on this?
Yeah, the modules for my curriculum will be on Canvas. So Isaac Stickney, who's our curriculum designer, is helping me kind of map them onto Canvas. And I think all of GME sort of automatically is able to log into Canvas quite easily. And my understanding from Isaac is that they will also be web accessible. So if people have the URL, they'll be able to log in as well. So the kind of intended audience is for graduate medical education, but I think these concepts apply to all of us, and we know that also there's some faculty development to be done around these topics. So I think it would be great if it's sort of widely shareable, and if it becomes a collective resource that a number of us kind of help curate over time and keep relevant and up to date, because this material, is constantly changing.
Great, thank you. And I would say on behalf of our staff, they are often the ones who are making a real difference with our patients in the moment, on the second people make a phone call or walk in the door. And this is really great for them to be able to learn as well. And if we're going to change as a system, everybody needs to take part. And I feel like I also would really love people's input, because I think I know that some of the best ideas I've learned do not come from faculty, no offense faculty, but they come from people doing the work and, seeing what's happening and being able to say, these are the places we need to intervene first.
I think I'd also like at some point to be able to see the curriculum you're putting together, Erin, as that advanced exploration, because I think you've got some amazing work in there, and then just a general DEI 101 basic concept, e-learn type thing that everyone has access to, for that same reason that you're talking about, Beth. There's just the basic concepts, and if we can just have everybody on the same page, then that gives us the space to go deeper and to do not harder, well, I guess it is harder work, but do more advanced work as well. So I'm hopeful that that will come at some point.
Terrific. And we have our task force. We've met once, and we're going to come up with some recommendations that we will align with your work, Ryan, and make sure that we're contributing. Because I think that's I think we have some work to do ourselves, but we also want to help move the institution forward. And we have a great group of people who jumped in immediately. So I feel like we're in a good place. Again, lots of thanks coming up on the chat to both of you. So thank you so much, and send us your slides, and we'll stay in touch.
Great, thank you.
All right, take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.